Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the Gospels, looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus. And today we are Jesus is still teaching in the temple, or speaking and teaching in the temple, and most of what we're going to run through this week is going to be in John. But today we're looking at Jesus is the light of the world, and this comes from John 8:12 through 20. And so what we see here is, yesterday we looked at, Jesus forgiving an adulterous woman, and then, while he was teaching, they brought this in front of him while, so he continues teaching. And so he says to them once more, starting in verse 12, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness because you will have light, the light that leads to life. I like this transition, right? So Jesus goes, and you have this adulterous woman, and again, I'm imagining this, and again, there's no biblical text proof that says this, but he had just forgiven this lady and said, neither don't go no sin no more. We don't know what happened to her. We don't know if she stood around and listened to Jesus teach, or she just took off. But we have this transition where he tells this lady to go and sin no more, and then he gives her an option of how that works. And so in verse 12, he says, I am the light of the world if you follow me. So he says, go and sin no more. And then he's saying, if you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness because you will have the light that leads to life. And so the Pharisees replied, you're making these claims about yourself, such testimony is not valid. And the reason that they're saying that is because he had no witness. And by Jewish law, you had to have a witness, and we're going to look at it in a second. And so Jesus told him, these claims are valid, even though I make them about myself. For I know where I came from and where I'm going, but you don't know this about me. And so, he's saying, you don't understand me. You judge me by human standards, but I do not judge anyone. He's going to eventually. Right now, he's not. And if I did, my judgment would be correct in every respect because I'm not alone. He says, the Father who sent me is with me. Your own law says that if two people agree about something, their witness is accepted as fact. I am one witness, and my Father who sent me is the other. Again, he's claiming to be the Son of God. Who is your Father? They asked. And so Jesus answered, since you don't know who I am, you don't know who my Father is. If you knew me, you would also know my Father. Jesus made these statements while he was teaching in the section of the temple known as the treasury. It's in this section of, I'm sorry, but he was not arrested because his time had not yet come. And you see this several times. They attempt to arrest him. They try to arrest him. And then once it becomes time to arrest him, it actually is pretty easy. It's not very hard. He lets it happen. He knows what's going to happen, and he allows it to happen. He doesn't fight him. And so we're going to see this play out later on. And so you see this exchange, and I like this transition, right? He tells this young lady who was caught in adultery, a woman who was caught in adultery. We don't know if she was young or not. Um, this woman who was caught in adultery, he doesn't condemn her, and he says, "Go and sin no more." And then he says, "I'm the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness." And you have to imagine what she was going through and what she was going, and she understood that darkness, and the people around her that saw this whole thing happen would have understood that darkness as well. And so he transitions it to a light, and follow me so you can walk in the light. And so the really the Pharisees here, right? They thought Jesus was either a lunatic or a liar. I mean, and honestly to say these things and not be who he was, he would literally be a lunatic. He'd be a crazy person. Because, if I started walking around my local town, or, my state, and started claiming to be the Son of God and that I was God, and that people needed to follow me and all these other things, people are going to think I'm crazy. I would be lying, and I would be crazy. And so if he did all these things and they weren't true, he would have been a crazy lunatic, an absolute crazy lunatic, and really one of the most deceptive people in the world, because the number of people he would have had to have got to work with him to for healings and for raising people from the dead and stuff like that, that it was all documented. When we see all this documentation, and then we see his followers after the fact continue it on, right after his resurrection. And to me, that's more proof of his resurrection, because if he had not risen from the dead, there's no way these people would be willing to die for it. There's just no way. If he had died, they put him in the ground and he never resurrected, then we would have never heard of him again. Well, he may be a small blip in the history book. There was this guy named Jesus, had some followers, he died on a cross. There's actually a lot of insurrectionists that the Romans recorded about that did that. Right, that was a common thing. There was common things of people who would bring up followers. Not all of them, claim to be Messiah or the God, but he backed it up. And so, that's one of the things that's convincing to me when you look at this is the fact that it carried on after the fact, right? I mean, there's no way people like Paul, who was a Jew going and killing Christians at the time, is going to convert and go and be willing to die, right, and be this committed to the cause of Christ. If what happened, what he writes about in Acts didn't really happen, or what Luke writes about in Acts didn't really happen. I mean, there's just no way. And so, I mean, again, and you might be able to get one, maybe two people who are crazy enough to be willing to die for that, but to get a whole group of people who witnessed it and saw it to do this, it's just unheard of. But anyways, so what's interesting here is, right, you either have that he's a lunatic or a liar, or you have the third option that he was telling the truth, which I just talked about. And most of the Pharisees refused to even consider that third alternative, right? They refused to even say that could be a possibility, that he would, they never recognized him as Messiah and Lord. Some, I wonder if some maybe after the fact did, but for the most part, most of them did not. And so what we need to learn, and I've talked about this before, if we're seeking to know Jesus, we do not need to close any door without looking through it honestly. There's so many of us, and I know this is hard, right? We're raised a certain way, or we're taught a certain thing, and we're taught to believe that, and it's like, no, you don't ever look at any other options. This is the way it is. And and I talk about my background growing up a little bit. Like there were people in our denomination who, like, you weren't allowed to read anything outside that denomination, or they didn't. It was highly discouraged, right? You wanted to keep this bubble, this echo chamber, and that's what the Pharisees had. And so it's not healthy. It's not healthy to read outside, or to only stick within your group and only listen to people in your group, because you become yes people, and you become echo chambers, and there's no discussion, right? There's no allowance for questioning and discussion, and being able to sit down and actually dive through it. This is what it says, you've got to believe it. And that's kind of how the Pharisees worked. And so they used the argument, right, that if Jesus' claims were legal, they weren't legally valid because he had no other witnesses. And so Jesus responded that his confirming witness is God himself. He lets them know that, and he keeps hitting at that and saying that to them, because Jesus was one witness, the Father being God was the other witness, and that was the number required by law in Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. So we see all this happening, and this exchange is going on in what's called the temple treasury. It was located in what's called the court of the women, and it had 13 collection boxes that were set up in the area for receiving the money offerings that they had, and 7 of the boxes were for the temple tax, and the other 7 for what was called free will offerings. People were for just out of free will to give to the temple and stuff like that, and that's a good thing, right? I mean, we look at this today. We're to give. We'll talk. We might hit on giving a little bit as one of our topics. It can be a tricky subject, but it is a good thing to give to the cause of the church. As long as the church is focused on the right things, and that's where we'll talk about that a little bit, because it can be easy to get off focus. But the main thing we see here, and in the last note, in the last verse 20, was that he wasn't arrested because his time hadn't come. The one thing that about Jesus, right? He was going to be arrested on his own terms when he wanted to be arrested, and that's what happened. Right, we see what with the night that he was arrested, he chose to do that. We're going to see Peter chose violence, but Jesus kind of tore that down, or took care of that, and so we'll see that and look at what how that played out. But again, Jesus is becoming a little more bold in his teachings, a little more in the temple. I mean, that was before, he's been out teaching around in the surrounding towns and villages and in the smaller areas, some small synagogues. But here he's going directly to the temple. He's going directly into the heart of the beast, as you will, with the Pharisees and stuff like that. And so he's really going and showing that he is the light of the world. And we need to remember that, right? We need to remember Jesus is the light of the world. We are to be representatives of his, and we are to be the light of the world. When someone sees us, we should be a light in a dark place, right? If someone's in a dark place and they see us and they come to us, or we come to them, it should be a light. It should be something that's, man, that is a relief to see them coming, not a discouragement, right? We should never be a discouragement. So I encourage us to focus on being the light of the world that Jesus was. As always, I appreciate you for watching these videos. If you have not taken the chance to subscribe, you can please do so. We're going to continue to produce these on a daily basis for now, and do this. We're going to get a little bit deeper into some other stuff as well as we go along. And as always, I appreciate everyone for watching.